as New Testament believers, followers of Jesus, how should we relate to Israel? How do we relate to her? How do we view Israel? And to understand that, we want to look at a few points the Apostle Paul gave us in the book of Romans. Now, the book of Romans is very important because Paul's writing primarily to Gentiles, which is most of us, most of the church now. And in it, he gives some instructions on how, as Gentiles who love Jesus, followers of Jesus, how we should view Israel. Because even in Paul's time, there was this temptation to what Paul called being arrogant or being ignorant. And that was a problem Paul identified, and it's a great temptation now because most followers of Jesus in the earth we're Gentiles, we're from the nations. So it's very easy for us to say, look at the church, it's mostly Gentile. And so Israel's part in the story is essentially finished. That's just Old Testament. And we can easily become ignorant, meaning we have no understanding that God still has a purpose for Israel in the story. And we can easily become arrogant, kind of go, you know what? Israel kind of failed in her redemptive calling, and so God's now called us, the nations, the church, to take the lead in the redemptive plan. And so Paul addresses both of these issues, and we want to look at four main points Paul gives us on how we relate to Israel. And I want to say this just briefly. Some of you may have gotten a revelation of Israel. Maybe you've been studying, and so you have understanding. I just want to say this. Sometimes I've seen believers get really excited about Israel, and they can be really critical of other believers who don't yet kind of see God's purpose for Israel. So notice that Paul didn't call these people apostate. He didn't treat them like they had fallen away from the faith. He said it's a little bit ignorant and arrogant not to understand Israel, but he still treated them with graciousness as part of the church. So as we're seeking understanding, we want to be gracious and treat each other as part of the family, part of the church, not just, oh, you're those people who don't understand Israel or something like that. So we want to learn from Paul there. The first one, this is Romans chapter 9, verse 2. Okay, and in this verse, Paul says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. So the main point here is Paul's inviting us that we should actually have a burden for Israel. It should bother us that Israel's not saved. If God was done with Israel and Israel's story didn't matter, Paul wouldn't use this kind of language, that I have unceasing anguish. That unceasing means it never stops. And the Greek word for anguish means physical, mental, and emotional pain. So Paul's going, I've got great pain over Israel's condition. And again, Paul is not just speaking as Paul, he's speaking as an apostle writing to the church. So as the church, we should receive this burden from Paul, and we want to have a burden over Israel's salvation as well. Notice, Paul is an apostle to the Gentiles, a man sent to the nations, but he says, I have unceasing anguish over Israel and her condition. So we're believers in the nations, but we want to receive this as an instruction from Paul as an apostle to have a burden for Israel, that there still should be a burden over her salvation. So that's point number one. We should have sorrow and anguish. It matters how Israel's story ends. Second point is Paul was in intercession for Israel. This is Romans chapter 10, verse 1. Paul said, brothers, my heart's desire, so there's a burning desire, emotion, his pain, and my prayer to God is that they would be saved. So Paul's response to his burden was intercession, right? So our first response to Israel's condition should be intercession. It starts with a heart desire, right? We're feeling that burden for Israel's condition. That should result in a prayer to God, intercession, and the content of that intercession is, Lord, would you release salvation? We want to see Israel saved. So because of Israel's condition, because of our love for Israel, we should engage in intercession for Israel. That's the second kind of part of our response to Israel. The third thing is Paul begins to give us, specifically to Gentiles, our missional responsibility. Okay, and I'll give you two verses for this. Romans chapter 10, verse 19. and Romans chapter 11, verse 11. Okay? Romans chapter 10, verse 19, Paul says, I will make you jealous, speaking of Israel, from those who are not a nation, and with a foolish nation I'll make you angry. So Paul's introducing this idea that a foolish people, meaning not the chosen people initially, the Gentiles in the nations, are actually going to make Israel jealous. And we can go, what does that mean? How could we make Israel jealous? I mean, Israel had the oracles of God given to her. God began the redemptive story. And Paul explains that in Romans chapter 11, verse 11, what he's thinking. So in chapter 11, verse 11, he's explaining what it means to make Israel jealous. He says, so I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? So did Israel stumble, meaning Israel's current situation, that they might fall, or that their story would just end? And notice Paul says, by no means. So he's saying Israel's story is not over just because Israel's in an unsaved condition and has made mistakes. He says through their trespass, through their mistake, through their falling away, salvation has come to the Gentiles. So the mystery that Israel's condition has caused the knowledge of God to go to us, for us to receive something that was not ours, so as to make Israel jealous. So Israel falls, which we've seen in history. That caused the gospel to go to the Gentiles. We've seen that. Why? Paul says it's to make Israel jealous. In other words, Israel's to look at the Gentiles and see the Gentiles coming into relationship with the God of Israel, receiving the Spirit of God, and that's to cause Israel to be jealous and say, wait a minute, that belongs to us, right? Communion with God was our inheritance. The Spirit of God was our promise. And so Gentiles receiving a salvation that's not theirs, right, kind of like an adopted son, is to make the firstborn son that was first given the offer of salvation jealous. So Paul says we have a responsibility to make Israel jealous. So we don't want to be arrogant towards Israel. We want to actually call Israel back to salvation. And the fourth thing Paul wants us to understand is that God's not finished with Israel. She will be saved. And that verse is Romans chapter 11, verse 25 to 26. And Paul says this, lest you be wise in your own sight, which we could say arrogant, lest you kind of be wise in your own opinion, another translation says, I don't want you to be unaware of this mystery. So God's plan is a mystery. A partial hardening has come upon Israel, meaning Israel's not yet saved. She's partially hard to the gospel, or partially blind. Not entirely, but partially. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, meaning Israel's salvation is actually being delayed until the gospel can go into all the nations, which is just a profound thing. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, verse 26, and in this way all of Israel will be saved. So we're to remember there's a promise. Israel's story is not over. She didn't just cause the gospel to go to the nations. She's actually going to receive salvation in the end. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion and will banish ungodliness from Jacob. So Paul's saying the end of the story is not Israel's present condition, it's Israel's future salvation. So Paul's exhorting us we should not be arrogant towards Israel as if she's kind of, her story is over, and we don't want to be ignorant. We want to understand four things. One, we should be have a burden for Israel's salvation. Two, we express that burden first of all through intercession. Thirdly, we have a responsibility to make Israel jealous, in other words, to call her back to the gospel. And fourth, the end of Israel's story is not Israel's current condition. It's actually Israel's coming salvation. So these four principles help us to relate biblically to Israel right now.